Welcome back. It's Tuesday, February 25th, and today we have an ongoing development of tropical cyclones across the country in both east and west parts. Tropical cyclone Bianca has actually exceeded intensification forecasts and is now a Category 4 severe tropical cyclone in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Western Australia, and tropical cyclone Alfred continues to wreak havoc with modelling and current data as to how this system will perform and whether it impacts the Queensland coastline. In today's forecast, we're going to discuss tropical cyclone Alfred's current position and intensity, as well as how this system is likely to behave with the current data over the next couple of days. Starting off in Western Australia, we can see here on the most recent satellite imagery off the coast of Western Australia, this is a tropical cyclone Bianca, in fact actually severe tropical cyclone Bianca, which has undergone rapid intensification overnight and has wrapped up itself into what is actually quite a powerful system. Now we can see here a very evident eye wall wrapping around the central circulation here, where this system has actually intensified well above the forecast model outputs, where it has now developed itself into a severe tropical cyclone Category 4 intensity. You can see here it's not a particularly large cyclone, it's sort of in that moderate size range, possibly slightly on the smaller side, but it is quite a powerful system, producing sustained winds over 165 kilometers an hour with gusts well over 230 kilometers an hour at this current stage. Now this system is certainly very impressive on the radar loop, and it continues to wrap itself up. It's actually very well structured for how long it's had to develop, but I guess that's just a really good indicator of how favorable the environment in the Indian Ocean is, especially off the northwest Australian coastline right now, with those very, very warm sea surface temperatures and a low amount of wind shear where this cyclone currently is positioned. However, this system will pose no threat to the Australian mainland and will rapidly disintegrate over the next 1 to 2 days as it continues the southward track and ends up in much cooler water, which will cut off the access to energy for the thunderstorm development around this system, as well as higher wind shear, which will rip the system apart. But certainly a impressive system nonetheless. If we just quickly switch to the IR satellite imagery for tropical cyclone Bianca, we can see that the intensification has slightly cooled off during the daylight hours. We're going to see this sort of darker band of thunderstorms here on the western quadrant are definitely simmering down in development. This is likely due to the increased turbulence of the atmosphere during the day. This system may actually develop a little bit further overnight, but it's certainly developed much better than anticipated with this very evident eye wall and a fairly well structured system that has wrapped up quite nicely over the last 2 to 3 days. Now, if we switch across to Queensland, where the most important part of this video is, we have tropical cyclone Alfred currently in the Coral Sea as a Category 2 tropical cyclone, expected to intensify into a Category 3 system over the next couple of hours into this evening. We can see on the Bureau of Meteorology's official forecast track map, we have a center of very destructive winds around this Category 2 tropical cyclone, which is currently positioned at approximately 700 kilometers off the coast of Queensland. Now we can see that their track map has definitely widened with this cone of uncertainty, which represents the possible scenarios that this system may undergo. Currently there's a lot of discrepancy about what this system will do. We can see in the general southerly to southwesterly arc that is on the map here, where the system continues as a Category 3 system, that it certainly has a slight arcing toward the Queensland coastline and is likely to approach closer than what it is now. However, currently the model guidance is not particularly good in predicting what the outcome might be. Most of the models currently place it tracking further towards the Queensland coast. However, some have it approaching much closer and potentially landfalling, while some have it keeping out to sea. We can see here though on the Bureau of Meteorology's official forecast track map that the system is anticipated to remain as a Category 3 system and probably is unlikely to undergo further intensification into a higher category system, where the energy within the ocean and the sea surface is unlikely to be able to provide that extra sort of boost of convective energy to be able to support those thunderstorms with a generally decreasing sea surface temperature the further south you track. And also the system is likely to encounter some increased wind shear within the more southerly region, especially closer to the coast, which will also hamper it from intensifying further. If we bring up the sea surface temperature map here, we can see that where the system currently is, it's essentially sitting within bathwater-like temperatures and conditions, where we have sea surface temperatures above 30 degrees C, which is really aiding to fuel those convective thunderstorms and help it intensify into a much more sustained compact system. Now we can see as it begins to track tracks south, the temperature of the sea surface definitely decreases, where we go from about sort of 30 to 31 degrees, and then as it tracks further south, the temperature rapidly drops off in this gradient here, where you can see the red sort of indicating at 28 to 27 degree temperatures. And then as it tracks further, where the models are sort of placing it right now, we can see that it continues to track further south toward this more orange gradient, 26, 25 degree temperatures, which again, as discussed before, will hamper the continual development into what could potentially be a stronger system had it had access to the warmer waters to really fuel those convective thunderstorms that would intensify the system further. We also pull up the wind shear map. This indicates the sort of speed and directional change within the atmosphere. Cyclones don't like a lot of speed and directional change as it rips the organization apart. We can see here where the system currently sits. It sits within a region of relatively weak wind shear indicated in the greens and yellows, but as it begins to track southward toward the Queensland coastline in that southwesterly track, the BOM outlined, we can see in the red contours here that the wind shear dramatically increases the further south it gets. Now we can see here 25, 30 to potentially as high as 50 knots much further south. Now the wind shear is likely to die a little bit in terms of its wind strength. I doubt that it would be 50 to 60 knots much further south towards the southeast Queensland and New South Wales border, but this system will certainly enter a region of increased wind shear, which will weaken the system and prevent it from intensifying further, but potentially could actually destroy the system and rip it apart altogether. But certainly something to watch within this region, as the wind shear and the amplification of the upper level trough, which is the driving and supporting factor for the increased wind shear across the southern extent of the region. So certainly something to watch across the region to see how it behaves when it enters this unfavorable environment. We switch here to the European model on the 850 millibar relative humidity. We can see here as we drag this out over the next couple of days that this system is also likely to be hampered by some drier air, which we can see here to the south in the more white and brown colors. Now as we continue to drag this out and the cyclone tracks more to the south and southwest, it is likely to encounter this dry air through the just above the surface layers, which will hamper the thunderstorm development as it counters the dry air which is closer to the south-southwest and also the coastline. If we switch to the 850 millibar wind speed, we can see here that the system currently where it is positioned is still fairly disorganized and a relatively broad and wide wind field with a stronger circulation in the center, of course, but still fairly disorganized. And as we can continue to drag this out throughout the next couple of days, we can see that it definitely ramps up into what the Bureau of Meteorology forecasted on their track map as developing into a severe category 3 tropical cyclone system, where you can see here the wind field is much more organized now and compact, especially around the central circulation within these white colored contours here around the center, indicating the much greater wind speeds nearing 100 knots near the central circulation. And then as we drag this out, we can see here over the next couple of days approaching the weekend where it definitely encounters that increased wind shear, where it becomes much more disorganized and starts to lose its northern quadrant boundaries as it enters the stronger wind shear and the dry air, which is acting to weaken the system. And then as it approaches the coastline, we can still see here, as indicated yesterday on some of the models, that it sort of dances around the coastal region rather than actually directly landfalling over it, possibly intensifying a little bit for a brief period before sort of curving back in toward the coastline and then crossing it as what is a fairly disorganized and ragged system at that point, likely hampered heavily by the wind shear, but certainly still indicating at that landfall crossing that it did yesterday on the European model. Compared to the GFS, we can see the GFS is much more on board comparatively to what it was yesterday in terms of the European model. We can see here that the system definitely ramps up in line with what the Euro also shows and the Bureau of Meteorology is forecasting, where we can see a severe system by the next 2 to 3 days within the Coral Sea, much more organized and stronger wind fields around the central circulation. And then as we continue to drag this out and it approaches the coastal area, the system becomes much more disorganized and ragged, much like the European model, where it encounters this increased wind shear and slightly dry air before approaching the coastline, similarly also stalling off the coastline and dancing around for a little bit just off the coast around sort of that Bundaberg region, tracking down slightly southward and then possibly crossing the coastline as a relatively weak and disorganized tropical cyclone sometime around the weekend hours, much more further north comparatively than what the GFS had shown yesterday, where what was definitely an outlier run, where it was much closer to the Queensland New South Wales border. Now if we switch to Axis G, we can see the Axis G is very much in line with the rest of the models in terms of forecast confidence, where it develops a severe tropical cyclone within the Coral Sea over the next 2 to 3 days. We can see that there's good agreement and confidence across the models with this. But then as we drag this out further toward the weekend, we can see that this system still assumes that sort of southwesterly track that most of the other models are indicating. However, as we approach the weekend, we can see that it is relatively close to the Queensland coastline, especially just east of the Bundaberg area, probably sort of 100 kilometers to 200 kilometers offshore. But then as we drag this out, we can see that it assumes much more of a southeasterly track and actually moves away from the coastline. So there's certainly discrepancy here between what the models are showing, where both the Euro and the GFS indicate a landfall. However, the Axis G model actually moves it away from the coastline, probably only scraping the coastline before moving back toward a initial southeasterly track that the system is on today, before that southwesterly curve takes over, and then now jumping back into a southeasterly track on Tuesday before intensifying the system further and moving away from the Australian mainland. Interestingly though, we can see that as we drag this out even further, sort of towards Wednesday and Thursday next week, which is getting into the realm of poor forecast confidence hours, we can see that the system seems to stall around the east of the Brisbane coastline on this model, and it sort of just hangs around and stalls for a little bit before indicating possibly that it may move back toward the coastline again on this sort of very erratic motion that we can't be sure of at this stage due to the poor forecast confidence and the long duration hours from this system. Now we can see across the models that there is good discrepancy and unsurety of what is actually going to happen between most of the global models, with lots of different outputs between them. Certainly no good agreement between them of what is actually going to happen, so this will definitely be one to watch, as we can see that the system is very unpredictable in nature. For now though, that's pretty much going to do it. We'll continue to monitor this very unpredictable system over the next couple of days for what is proving to be a very difficult system to forecast, with no good agreement currently, even just a few days out, with this system and its movement and erratic nature. Frequent updates will be needed to determine whether a potential landfall scenario does eventuate with this system. We'll join you back for the next forecast tomorrow.